Russia accuses Britain and the United States of trying to incite conflict in the Black Sea by refusing to accept that Crimea is part of Russia. Tensions run high following the presence of a British destroyer off the coast of the Crimean Peninsula. On Wednesday, the UK said their ship was conducting innocent passage through Ukrainian territorial waters. Russia says its forces fired warning shots and dropped bombs to deter the British ship, accusing it of entering Russia's territorial waters. Both sides accuse each other of producing inaccurate accounts of the standoff. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Moscow will defend its borders by all means, warning Britain that in the future bombs would be sent not only in its path but also on target if there were any further provocative actions. Joining us on tonight's debate, we have our correspondent, Amina Taylor, who's joining us from the British capital, London. Amina, please bring us up to speed where these tensions could be heading.
Well, unfortunately, Badia, it's never a good sign when an escalation of this magnitude concerns as many countries as it does, because we're not just talking about whatever a country's particular position is on the 2014 standoff between the Ukraine and, of course, the Russian Federation here. Britain conducted what they're saying was an innocent naval exercise in disputed waters. So it didn't even really matter, actually, if they believe that those waters were the territorial property of the Russian Federation or not. The fact that you would stir the pot, as it will, by having HMS Defender come through that territory at such diplomatically sensitive times. There are, of course, naval exercises, Operation Sea Breeze, taking place in the Black Sea nearby, which Russia has called on the United States and its allies to cancel. And for Britain to do this act at this time is sending one very clear message. It is an escalation in events, and it doesn't matter what the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Defense say about disputing the sequence of events or disputing whether or not bombs were dropped and shots were fired. The fact is, in such sensitive areas, in such a sensitive situation, to have your naval vessel, your armed naval vessel, go all that way from British waters to essentially stir up a hornet's nest is not really sending a message of diplomacy and a message of wanting to take this as a matter between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The United Kingdom and the United States have clearly chosen sides here, and depending on who blinks next, this could be a serious, very serious issue. Let's not be candid about this, but let's not mince our words here. International global conflicts have started for less.
All right, thanks a lot, Amina. Press TV's Amina Taylor joining us from the British capital, London. We're bringing in now author and historian Marcus Papadopoulos, who's with us also from the British capital. Mr. Papadopoulos, welcome to the program. Talk to us about where this incident happened and whether Russia's response was justified, in your opinion.
Well, the staged provocation orchestrated by Britain and America, in which a Royal Navy vessel, specifically HMS Defender, illegally entered Russian maritime waters adjacent to the Crimea, was a foolhardy and, worse still, an exceedingly dangerous act which could have provoked a military conflict between the West and Russia. And I say that America was also involved in this staged provocation because London and Washington work in unison on the international stage, especially when it comes to Russia. So the question we have to address is this: why did London and Washington stage a provocation in Russian maritime waters? I do not believe that the West seriously intends to provoke a conflict with the Russian Federation, because a conflict with the Russian Federation would start with a military conflict and would rapidly escalate into a nuclear conflict in which mankind would simply put, be wiped out. So I believe that the intended objective of the British-American staged provocation was to add momentum to building up the case for, firstly, NATO's increasing presence on the western border of the Russian Federation, and secondly, for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO. The official argument of the British government that British naval vessels are perfectly entitled to enter the waters around the Crimea because London does not recognise the Crimea as part of Russia, instead it recognises the Crimea as part of Ukraine, is untenable. Why? Firstly, even though London never recognised the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union, nonetheless, the British government never deployed Royal Naval vessels to Soviet maritime waters off the coast of the Baltic states. And secondly, if the logic of the British government is to be extended across the world, then other nations in the world should not accept or respect British jurisdiction over the North of Ireland or Northern Ireland, or British jurisdiction over the Falkland Islands or the Malvinas, or indeed British jurisdiction over the Chagos Islands. So quite frankly, the British-American staged provocation was part and parcel of a campaign to build up the case for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO, to portray Russia in an exceedingly negative way in which the Russians are projected as aggressive and dangerous, and thirdly, to justify the increase in NATO's budget and thereby defend the ongoing increases in NATO soldiery and weaponry along the Russian border in Eastern Europe, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea.
Okay, Mr. Papadopoulos, you pretty much said it all. That almost wraps up tonight's debate for us. Let's cross over now to editor of Veterans Today, Mr. Mike Harris, who's joining us from Phoenix. Mr. Harris, welcome to the program. I'm sure you were listening to what Mr. Papadopoulos was saying in London. Give us your viewpoint on this. Was this a provocation by the British Royal Navy, or was it what they were saying themselves, a legitimate exercising of the right of passage at sea?
Well, it absolutely was a provocation by the British Navy. And in fact, on Veterans Today, we published today the tape that the FSB released from the bridge of the Russian warship that fired the 3 rounds across the bow of the British destroyer. So that is up, it's there. The British destroyer was warned both in English and in Russian multiple times, and they ignored their warnings and proceeded ahead. And after multiple warnings, then the Russian ship did fire warning shots across the bow to back the British off. So they were duly warned verbally multiple times, and they proceeded anyway. So this was a British provocation. Now you have to remember that the U.S. has been meddling in Ukrainian affairs since 2004. I was there in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. And I have been to Crimea. I've been to the Russian naval base in Sevastopol. And Russia is not going to give that asset up. They have an agreement with the Ukrainian government to keep functioning. And if you remember correctly, after Victoria Nuland and the US CIA and other intelligence agencies toppled the Yanukovych government, the Crimean people voted overwhelmingly via referendum to join the Russian Federation. And so they seceded from Russia, and they went back to being, seceded from Ukraine and went back to being a Russian state, which is where they were before Nikita Khrushchev ceded Crimea to Ukraine back in 1959, 1960, I forget the exact date. But historically, Crimea has been a Russian asset. And historically, most of Ukraine has been a Russian asset. If you go back historically, the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, used to be the capital of the Russian Empire. So people need to keep this in mind, that these are primarily Russian people, Slavic people from Russia, Russian speaking, and the U.S. is over there meddling and interfering, and the British are helping them.
Right. Mr. Papadopoulos, let's go over some of the details of the timeline. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, on Thursday, he said that it was entirely right for their warship to travel through the waters off Crimea, and it was acting in accordance with international law. Now, this is all going on as there's amid a diplomatic spat between Russia and London. When tensions were high between Kiev and Moscow back in 2018, the UK also sent a Royal Navy ship to the Black Sea port of Odessa in a show of support for Ukraine. This, of course, happened in 2018, so this is not without precedent, is it?
The root cause of tension between the West and Russia revolves around NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and also into the Baltic states, which formerly were a part of the USSR. Now, the Americans have been coveting Ukraine ever since Ukraine became an independent state in December of 1991. Why is Ukraine so important to Washington? Namely, if America is successful in its ambition to admit Ukraine into the ranks of NATO, then America will be the dominant naval power in the Black Sea. Russian influence and power in Europe would be severely curtailed, and thereby Russian influence and power in the world in general would be severely curtailed. The British government cites international law as the basis for why HMS Defender entered the waters around the Crimea. But quite frankly speaking, the British government doesn't have a leg to stand on, so to speak, because the Ukrainian constitution was severely violated in February of 2014 when a democratically elected president who was recognized by both America and the European Union and also Britain was overthrown in a Western orchestrated coup. Therefore, the Ukrainian constitution was in February 2014 dead, so to speak. And as a result of the coup, which brought to power authorities which had no legitimacy whatsoever, the people of the Crimea, who are overwhelmingly Russian, and those people who identify as Ukrainian but nonetheless regard Russia as their mother country, came together to resist what had happened in Kiev and to seize the opportunity to break away from Kiev and to reunite with Russia. And that was the will of the people of the Crimea. As I said moments ago, if the British are going to apply the argument that their Royal Navy vessels can enter the waters of the Crimea because they do not recognize the Crimea as part of Russia, then quite frankly, the Russian Navy can enter the waters of the North or Northern Ireland, because Moscow could take the line that it doesn't recognize British jurisdiction over the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland.
Let's go back to Mr. Harrison Phoenix. This is an issue that Mr. Papadopoulos has brought up on 2 occasions now. How does, in your opinion, all of this, the Black Sea incident, the Western troop buildup in Ukraine, in addition to NATO's eastward expansion, how does this all play into the rivalry between Russia and NATO? As we know, Russia has already made it clear that NATO membership for Ukraine would be a red line for Moscow.
Well, you have to remember, after the Berlin Wall came down, that the U.S. entered an agreement with the Russian Federation that NATO would not expand eastward. And they have violated that agreement both in the spirit and in implementation, because they have expanded greatly to the east. This was not what the Russian Federation signed on for, and the U.S. and NATO is in direct violation of that accord. So that is one point. Like I said, historically, Ukraine has been allied with Russia, and in fact, at one time, Kiev was the capital of the Russian Empire. The people there are essentially, by genetic, descent, are Russians. They are the Slavic people, and to try to peel that off of their close bond would be like the U.S. peeling away from Canada. And another analogy I'd like to make is can you imagine if the Russians or the Chinese would send warships into the Gulf of Mexico? The U.S. would be coming unglued, and they would use any means possible to expel them from that American lake down there that we call the Gulf of Mexico. That is exactly the position that the U.S. has put Russia in by needing to expel these foreign interlopers that have no claim and no business being in the Black Sea at all. The Black Sea is a Russian lake, and it has been and it will continue to be unless the U.S. and the Western forces of NATO wish to go to full-scale war with Russia, because they will defend their territory. And the U.S. has been aching for an engagement with Russia for some time. This is very, very unwise, and I really caution against it. And I really hope that the powers that be in the U.S. within our government come to their senses and back off of this, because this is extremely dangerous. As Mr. Papadopoulos has said, this could lead to a nuclear confrontation, whether it's at the tactical level or on the strategic level. In any case, it will be a disaster for the area and for all the people of the planet.
Mr. Papadopoulos, one detail that we skipped here was the war of words between Moscow and London, which escalated on Thursday. Both sides accused one another of giving inaccurate accounts of the incident. Moscow's version of events goes as such that a Russian aircraft bombed the path of the British destroyer. London dismisses Moscow's version of events as, quote-unquote, predictably inaccurate. What do you see with these two different and somewhat contradicting accounts?
Well, they certainly are contradictory accounts. However, the Russian version of events has been corroborated by the Kremlin. There is footage of the standoff between a Russian tactical fighter aircraft and HMS Defender, but also we have insiders from the British Ministry of Defence and also from British journalists who were on board HMS Defender at the time, who have also confirmed that the Russian version of events is the accurate version and that 10 Downing Street is not telling the truth. But let me add this. There will be no further NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. There may be NATO expansion into Southeastern Europe, specifically Serbia and Bosnia, but as regards NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, that has come to an end, because the Kremlin will use all means at its disposal, and I mean all means at its disposal, to ensure that Ukraine never enters NATO, because a Ukraine in NATO would mean that Russian national security would be seriously compromised. Russia would no longer be the dominant naval power in the Black Sea. NATO tactical aircraft operating from Ukrainian territory could enter the skies above Moscow in 12 to 15 minutes. So there will be no further NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. And secondly, I would say this to Whitehall, to the British government: instead of attempting to goad Russia by deploying Royal Naval vessels into Russian maritime waters, Whitehall should instead ensure that the Royal Navy is protecting the English Channel from illegal immigrants who are crossing on a daily basis from France into England, specifically Dover, because British taxpayers' money is being misused. British sailors are the lives of British sailors are being put in danger in the Black Sea. British sailors should be in the English Channel defending England, defending Dover from illegal immigration from Calais. I think the British taxpayer, if they knew the full story, if Britain had a free and independent media, would be livid at the knowledge that the Royal Navy, instead of defending the English Channel, is deployed to the Black Sea and is potentially risking a military and nuclear confrontation with Russia, which, as I said at the beginning of this program, would, if it came about, signal the end of mankind.
Let's get one last question in from Mr. Harrison. Phoenix, Russia, as you mentioned, annexed the Crimean Peninsula following a referendum back in 2014. So obviously it considers areas around its coast to be Russian waters. Sergei Ryabkov said that Washington and London are sowing strife by refusing to accept Crimea as part of Russia. There is clear hypocrisy here again by the likes of the U.S. Mr. Papadopoulos mentioned a few instances, for example, the Malvinas, which are have been annexed, or in other words, occupied by the British for years. There is another example also when the Israelis, they want to annex the Golan Heights. The United States accepts it. When they want to annex parts of the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, the United States will accept that. So they can accept illegal annexations and occupation by their allies, like the Israelis, but when it's not in their own interest, they'll oppose it.
Well, that's entirely accurate. And I need to agree with Mr. Papadopoulos again, because the U.S. has the same problem with our southern border. We should not be deploying troops around the world. We should be defending our own border and using our military resources to expel the invaders who are pouring into our country the same way that British soldiers, British sailors should be defending the British coast from the invasion of Calais. We've got the exact same problem here. It appears the Western governments are more driven to expand their empire and expand their grasp of control of the world's resources than they are in defending their own countries. And this is a mistake. This is not why people join our military. They join our military because they love our country, they want to defend it and defend it, but yet they're not defending our own borders. They're wide open, and we have immigrants pouring in from everywhere in the world. And this is just another symptom of the sickness that is going on within the United States government.
Okay.
Our government is ill. We need systemic reform here in the U.S., and we need to get a foreign policy that works for the American people, not for this expansion of Western empire.
Very well. Thank you, gentlemen. Author and historian Marcus Papadopoulos joining us from the British capital, London. Also thanks to editor of Veterans Today, Mike Harris, joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. And also special thanks to you, our guests, for joining us, for staying with us on tonight's debate. It's good night for now, and see you next time, everybody. Bye.